You got the notes.
I can pull up the notes.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. We're about to start our next presentation here, so go ahead and take it away.
Okay, let's start. So this session is about the first steps to go to a global market, or first steps to go global. And my name is Rajiv Krishnan. I'm a senior lead for globalization at Coupa Software. I have been in IT industries for the last 20 years, out of which 15 years has been in localization engineering, translations, IIT and now globalization. And Coupa is the leader in business spend management. Our software helps our customers to make their spend more effective, profitable, and sustainable. So it's mostly to do with suppliers, payments, and buyers. So as with any modern companies, Coupa also grew just by innovation and acquiring different products, right? So acquiring different products came with different global teams who had a different understanding of IIT or different standards for IIT, and they had different technical stacks, right? So to integrate these products into our core Coupa products, and especially on the IIT front, we had to centralize the IIT process and LTN process so we could deliver a consistent user experience across our customers, across our products. So with these things as the requirements, we created a centralized globalization team which would work on core product and work as a consultant for other Power Apps or other applications which are trying to integrate with our core product. And a translation is completely owned outside the engineering org by the localization team. We have one engineer, localization engineer, who would be a bridge between the localization team and the core globalization and the engineering teams. And next, we will see how we do this. So to scale, what we did was first we standardized the IIT process tools and the IIT knowledge, right? So standardization is basically creating awareness of IIT across your engineering org. So this is through evangelization, and it can be, we do it through different like self-guided courses, through new employee orientation programs, newsletters, open Slack channels, things like that. And apart from it, we also have officers. So we have for IIT 3 different levels. One is your basic, which we will cover in the upcoming slides. Basically, this is must know for all developers. So whoever joins has to go through this. The second is an intermediate course, which would talk about a little complicated IIT features like pluralization, how to use your personal names, address, and how to use our Coupa standard IIT tools and other things. The last one would be an advanced course for our developers. This is for custom translations, how to implement custom translation, because we have a feature where you can override our translation for customers, and then user translations, like how they can translate their own user inputs, and then we have address and other right to left language customization, etc. The second part is to centralize. This is where we centralize all our I18 data, I18 tools, uh, uh, and other, and we support these for all technical stacks like Ruby, .NET, Java. Right. The third one is automation. This plays a huge part for scaling, and this automation is for your localization process, your I18 checks, which you do, and then other automations for testing and other things. Today, our localization process is what we call as a non-event. So people just, we just translate them and integrate them. And other than localization testing, people will not know that it's a non-event for them. So it just runs in the background. Once these three are done, then the scaling can be achieved. And we will see an example of how we, we do the scaling by region and language. Region and language. Then this is where we try to evangelize the I18, and these are the basic things which we tell our developers. The first and important thing is they have to know is I18 is different than L10, right? So your localization team is different, your localization is different, I18 is different. Right. So we introduce them about what is globalization, what is I18, and what is L10, right? So globalization, it is the strategy, architecture, tools, things, and this is involves uh, uh, all the teams company-wide, right? So if you're going to a new market, you work with your marketing team, the subsidiary in that region, things like that, to understand sales teams, support team, and then we go for the new markets. I18 is basically a developer or an engineering team-owned uh, task, right? This is preparing your English product for the global needs. This is like externalizing currencies, time zones, etc. Preparing English product for to be translated. This is basically your localizability. And we educate the developers saying that their English product should be I18 and ready even before they can be localized or can be translated. Right? L10N, it's the process of translating the software into other languages and doing customization for specific language or a region. Right? And particularly on I18N, these are the four basic things we ask our developers and educate them that they should be Unicode enabled. All the products has to be Unicode enabled. It has to support regional formats, and what we call I18 data is basically our CLDR data, and that it should be localizability ready. Right. So in Unicode, again, to the developers, what we say is users should be able to input any language, right? We should be able to store them, process them, display them according to that language standards or Unicode standards, right? They might be using your English product or any product, but their input can be of any language. So example is our English product is being used in Dubai and they want to have their names and other things in Arabic. So this is the basic and the first element. If a product doesn't support Unicode, it cannot be integrated into our core. So, and since ours is a web application, UTF-8 is our standard, right? It has a backward compatibility to English and all our HTML tags are in English. So we use UTF-8. Next is the byte order mark. So whenever we are working with Excel files or Windows applications, we make sure and ask our developers to add this byte order mark as an instance. So that's why in our export features, we have two: export to CSV, export to CSV with Excel. So because customers download these files and they open up in Excel, right? Even though it is in CSV. So it's not a technological limitation. So we just add the byte order mark to accommodate that. The next step for IIT9 is the regional formats, right? Daytime numbers, everything should follow the local and not an language, right? So we ask them that language is your UI language, but these should follow locals. So this cannot be externalized into a resource file or something like that. And it has to be through an library, or in Coupa, we have a separate formatted resource files. So it has to go through that. Yeah. Right. In Coupa, what we did was we did not use the standard I18 and GEM because we had some custom locals and other issues. So we used a local formatting specific resource file. So all the formats are stored in a single file, and we use that one. And that formatted resource files is created using CLDR. So whenever there is a Unicode CLDR release in spring and in fall, we use them to regenerate the formats file. And the next one is we use language fallbacks. That's we use one language like English, GB, or UK for all English other than EN US. So for that to accommodate, the locals has to be different. In, like, for example, your date format in ENCA is different. Numbering format in ENIN is different. So for that, we introduce something called thin locals. So these thin locals are basically, we'll have different English formats. For example, we have about 40 different English formats, but we have one or two English languages. So we fall back for all other UI resources to those English files, and the rest we fall back to these thin locals to load their specific ones. Next is what is an I18 and data. This is basically, since we are working with payments, suppliers, we have a lot of compliance standards. And so we have to have certain countries, and we integrate with a lot of ERP solutions. So what we had to do was we had to standardize these data, like country name should be the same list of countries with the same names, same codes across all the products we use. So we kind of centralized this data, and then we used to create libraries on around these data. And these data are created using, again, CLDR data, where we use all the translation names and other things. On top of it, we have some Coupa specific customizations. Like, for example, CLDR doesn't consider US Armed Forces as a state, but we have to consider US Armed Forces for buying and selling. So we add those kind of Coupa specific customizations, and CLDR gives you this I18 and data. And we have some libraries around this for the teams to consume. And we will see this again in the library when we are looking at libraries. And then when we are talking about localizability, these are very basic things a developer should know. There are other other specifications, but for beginners, we always say there should not be any hard-coded strings. Everything has to be externalized. And even though these are basics, we still run across a lot of products which are coming in newly, where they have stored their data in databases or in some XML files, right? The next thing is, once you externalize, you use sudo to verify these, whether it is externalized and whether they are working correctly, like string concatenations and other things should not be there, right? The word order, yeah, in this word order only, we educate them, like, you cannot use string concatenation, for example. And if you're having parameters, you have to, like, explain what the parameter is, right? Whether it is person, object, or things like that. So we educate them, we give them examples on the word order and other things, and ask them to use like provide context and use simple English, right? So, and translator translating these is looking at a text and not your UI. So translating them will be much more easier if you can give them a simple English and provide some context around it. And then we also encourage them not to use any of the upper lower casing in their code. That has been another issues. You cannot do your stylings in your code or use upper lower cases. And the last one, and the important one, is there should not be any text in images. Right, localizing a text with image is a way more costly and time-consuming process than rather than translating text. Once we educate them and standardize or create a guidelines around it, the next step is to make sure we centralize certain data, right, which are critical to this. So, for example, this one is to like user interface components. So we have a central UX team. We work with the central UX team to create components which are I18 enabled or I18 and ready. So your calendar control, for example, will follow a local and a date picker, time picker are other examples, right? So you pass the language. If you don't pass the language, it would pick up whatever is available in the core as the default. But other teams will be using these components as is. So they don't need to implement their own I18 and specific things. So that's one way of standardizing this. And we also have some common CSS files which will be converted to RTL on during packaging time, so that the teams which are consuming can use the right CSS file. And we will see that example when we look at scaling. And the next one, this is the I18 and data part which we were talking about. So we have like address, local information, calendar, currency information, everything is centralized in one location in one library. And we have created the libraries on top of this data. So Rails has a gem file, Java, .NET has their own packaging. So once these are ready, these can be consumed directly by the teams. So it supports different stacks, and so all of them are, even though they are using different packaging, and the underlying data is the same. So we get a consistent user experience across our product. Next is automation. So this is where we will see how we are automating the localization process. So when we are adding a new string or a new file, right, what we have is a centralized translation repo. So these repos get synced up with the English files from the different product repos on a daily basis. So that is completely automated using Jenkins and Ruby. So it on a daily basis, we get the latest English files as of morning. Once this translation repo is ready, our translation or localization engineer starts his localization project or handoff. So he pulls all the data from this translation, centralized translation report. And once that project is ready, and that is automated in our TMS. So once it is ready, the files are available now for vendors to translate them. So they will be translating, and once translators complete their translation, the translation files are then moved back into the translation repo. Once the translation repo is updated, the cycle is completed, and we are ready to create a pull request or for the different repos, our client repos, to send back the translation. During this pull request is again owned by globalization teams, and we have automated this using Jenkins and Ruby. So this process is where we do all our translation checks. So if an English got updated during this process, which is very often, we try to remove the translation so that it falls back to English. So Ruby in that sense is a little different than other technologies where your entire translation files is loaded into the memory. So if it doesn't have a local available, it will automatically fall back to English. So if an English got updated, we will immediately remove the corresponding translation keys and values. Then we check for whether there is any valid English files, whether the parameters mentioned in the English are available in the English in the translated files, whether the encoding is right, whether the language file names are correct, these things. So once this pull request is created and it passes all the translation requirements checks, what we then the client PR is created and the PR is then reviewed manually for sanity checks and confidence of the developers. And once that is done, it is then merged into this. So this entire process for us currently, we have a 2-week period. This is basically because our sprints are in 2 weeks and we are an enterprise product. So there is no like what we once we release, we have a stabilization period. So we catch up the translation during the stabilization period. So that's why we have a 2-week time. But our ultimate goal is to have it on demand. So whenever they want to have translations, they can pull in the translation. But for the time being, we have other priorities and there is no requirement as to shorten this cycle. The second automation is like for the linguistic, this process. What we have done is we have used Selenium WebDriver to run through the different URLs and create screenshots for it. Once these screenshots are available, it is moved to the local vendor to do the linguistic reviews. So this is the chance they get to see their translation in context and to provide, okay, this translation has to be updated or things. So once the local vendor sees that has to be a translation update, he goes and creates a ticket, which is again automated in TMS. And then the subsequent changes are approved because once the translation change request comes in, it has to be reviewed by the language managers to approve it. Once they approve it, then these translation changes are picked up in the next translation cycle. And localization testing, we have some automated testings. These are basically your unit testing. The TeamCity, like we use UI testing, we use TeamCity. So we have some future UI testing. In both this unit test and as well as features test, we check for certain translation, which has to have certain words, translated words correctly, like invoice or your receipt. These are some standard translations which cannot be changed as is for compliance reasons. So that's one translation checks we do. We check for regional formats. And then in feature testing, we use Unicode characters for search, for store inputs, things like that. Then we have our sanity test to run the screenshots randomly on some languages and check whether those are loaded correctly and there is no other issues. And last one is we have some customer issues which we call tickets. Those things we have to test it manually to make sure that it is fixed, and then we assign it to the customers to review it. So once we have all these three, we are ready for scaling, right? So for in this example, we will see how we added Arabic, a right to left language, right? So once the product team was ready, with a language requirement, they create these new language requirements, and then they come up to the globalization team. And we do the specifications and decide what is the scope of this work language and how we can enable. In this particular example, what we did was we enabled Arabic, and since Arabic is a right to left languages, we had to introduce certain features in our globalization in the core product itself. One of them was setting the direction of the application itself based on the language which we are using. So once the direction of the application is set, the subsequent pages inherited that property and the entire UI was flipped. And then we had to create and right to left CSS file. We were debating on having the one CSS file for both, but then there was some styles and it was bloating up the CSS and the performance. So we had to separate it out in separate CSS files. And for this, we are using a tool called RTL CSS. It's an open source. It had good support for converting, and as well as you can have the ability to lock in style if you don't want to override them and other features. So we used RTL CSS file, and we then, when it came to Ruby, we had to override the style sheet tag function so that it can use the right CSS file based on language. So once these features were available, we had to create the other thin locales. These are, so for us, Arabic is Arabic Saudi Arabia, which is our primary language. And the rest of the thin locales like Arabic UAE, Arabic Egypt, everything was considered thin locales. So we had to create those. Once the globalization came, we created these features. Then we handed over this to localization team, and the localization team started translation. So the translation took us around 6 months to translate because of a string count. But once it was ready, the first set of translations were ready. It joined our translation cycle. And then we used a screenshot automation to get the screenshots of Arabic language. We sent it to linguistic reviews as well as native speakers. And once we got our feedback, then the feedback of those translation changes are part of our continuous feedback cycle. And that's how we enable Arabic. And this is another stat on how we have been growing from 2012. So we started with one product, and now we are supporting about 16. And we are adding about 3 teams in each release for every 4 months. And from language wise, we have grown from 8 languages to 28 languages, and in regions 8 to 88. And our English string count has been increasing. And yeah, and with the translated word counts. And this is another stat on how much of active users we have. We have about 33% of non-English speakers in our product or daily users. And then we have about in some instances where English is there in all the instances by default, but German and other things are about 30%. And then we have other languages like this. So Greek was the last, Greek and Romanian were the last to be added. So they are less, but this is one statistic of how the languages are used in our product. Yeah, and that's all. Now open up for question and answers. Yeah.
Just a minute.
Yeah, I'm curious about the automated screenshotting that you're doing. How do you identify what pages to screenshot? How do you ensure that you get like all the right data sets to hit those pages?
So that particular feature team who wants these screenshots, they provide us with a list of URLs. So what when we are talking to them, we always ask them, you are the product owner, you know the product better, we know the languages and other things. So what would your customers' happy path be, right? What is the critical path they use on a daily basis? And so usually the product teams have these statistics of what pages are mostly visited and what is the issues they're having with. And then on top of it, we also have reviews of what are the pages most likely affected by IE89, right? Is there a calendar control on that page? Or is there a lot of user inputs there? Whether you are showing an address format in those pages. So those are also considered, and then we arrive at the list of pages. But mostly it is from the product teams. They decide which pages has to be ready for screenshots.
And actually, I guess a follow-up question. Do they just give you a URL, or do they give you like a user that's in a particular state? How do you ensure all of the right data is present for the pages you're checking?
So they write the scripts for the automation, and the data, they provide the data, but we take into account whether it has to be I18. So the data they themselves use has to be I18 and ready. So for example, if they are having an user first name and last name, we make sure that we change the first name and last name and use our personal name functions so that it displays, for in Japanese, we use the last name plus san, right? So those things will be considered. So if they're coming and saying that it has to be, this is the data we are using, then we try to I18 and that data for testing.
Thank you.
So I had one question. You talked about managing date values and that you had internalized, you were managing date values internally. And I'm curious if you're managing like picture strings for formatting and the locale data, because you aren't using like some of the skeleton type functionality that's in ICU, date time pattern generator, that kind of thing. Is that what you're working around is a gap in that capability, or is it that your CX designers just can't leave it alone and have to have their own thing?
No, this was created back. I guess this was one of the things which is a legacy input we are carrying, a debt we are carrying. Our ultimate goal is to externalize or move away from these formats and try to use we are creating our own APIs, which are consuming CLDR data. Like for example, we are thinking about Java, ICU for Java to provide all these API capabilities. But currently, this is a legacy design, and we didn't want to create an API for this Ruby alone, because it is easier to use the native date functions rather than hitting an API, getting it formatted and using it. So till we get that API sorted out, we are sticking with this legacy. Right. Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned about like there are 4 kinds of testing, and for like unit, feature, and sanity, you were able to automate that. But you mentioned there's like a manual testing. Is manual testing something that every feature needs to go through, or there are certain features, like what kind of features that you will use like manual testing?
I guess we are talking about manual testing is only for our JC tickets those are customer issues.
Okay.
Customer has reported that these issues
Yeah.
are in they're experiencing it, right? So once we fix them, we know it is fixed, but before going to the customer, we have to manually review it and make sure that it is fixed, and then it goes to the customer. So we don't spend time on automating that because we feel that it is a one-off instance.
And I have one more question regarding like automation of the screenshot. Because like during my like own like internship experience, there's a common issue is that sometimes we were not sure if all the screenshots are captured through the automation system. So do you have any process to ensure that all the user interfaces that must be screenshot are accurately captured?
Yeah, we do not capture all the URLs or all the screens, right? It is the most critical or most often used screens which we review them.
Yeah, but how do you
And-
validate that?
And that comes from the product team, right? Each product team who owns those features, they give us the list saying that these are the features or these are the pages which are commonly used, which are the critical ones for the customers. And they provide us with the list. And then we review our I18N features and say which feature or which pages are affected by I18N the most. And we combine those two and create the list. And it is not a complete list. It is just high viewed pages or highly used pages.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Great. We have time for 5 more questions. We're going to run a little bit over here because we got started a little bit late. So we have time for maybe two more questions.
Hi, it looks like you guys have a very polished process, and I'm curious how successful you are with engaging the design team. By the nature of your product, I guess there are a lot of charts and tables you want to show, and it's kind of the same at my company, Gap Inc.
Mm.
And like there is constant struggle between designers to show everything, especially on the mobile app that
Yeah.
store associates use to show the chart nicely. But like when the text expands, it's terrible. So
Exactly. So the working with UX teams as an engineer, we have our own what we call as limitations, because the UX product, when we engage with them, we tell them it is not only for your English product, right? All their designs, everything, what they do is for their English product. So what we ask them is like, it's a global company, it's one source or one line of code. We cannot have different specifications for each language. So we ask them to think global, and it comes more like I18N is mostly awareness. Like if you are aware that there is going to be someone who is going to use this in a different environment, you will think about that. So basically, we work with them through office hours and other things and educate them. And then we also make sure that they have something like sudo, for example, where they can see their designs by expanding it to certain limitations. So we have about 30% expansion on both sides to verify the UI. But since we are in web applications, we are mostly okay because the UI as the browser itself is fine. We have mobile applications, and that follows a different story with working with UX team. But most of the time, what we say is when they're creating any React component or any UX, they have to at least look into 2 or 3 different locales, right? We always tell them to look in for German for the longer strings and other concatenations. We use Chinese or Japanese to make sure that it's double byte things UI also doesn't look because it's much more shorter. And then now we are asking them to enable RTL so that they can see how it flows. So because there might be some direction icons and other things which has to be flipped. And yeah, like for example, question mark. All our help is a question mark and we had to flip all the icons. So these things, we educate them saying that this has to be considered before they can finalize any design. So it's basically evangelization. That's the most.
Great, and that question actually brought us to the end of our time slot. So if you have more questions for Rajiv,
Yeah.
he'll be here, I think, for the rest of the UTW, so you can come and ask the rest of your questions. But let's give Rajiv a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.